بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم إن الحمد لله نحمده ونستعينه ونستغفره ونعوذ بالله من شرور أنفسنا ومن سيئات أعمالنا من يهده الله فلا مضل له ومن يضلل فلا هادي له وأشهد أن لا إله إلا الله وحده لا شريك له وأشهد أن محمدا عبده ورسوله. So this is a recap of lesson 34 in our series on Taqreeb Tadmuriyyah. And there are two handouts for this lesson. The first handout is titled The Principle Used in Negation. And so this is really a summary of the previous two lessons in which we were speaking in some detail about how do we negate from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in accordance with the Quran and the Sunnah and avoid false or ambiguous vague principles. What is the way of negation? And so in those two lessons we basically established that when we look in the Quran, we know already that our principle in describing Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in general is to affirm for Allah whatever He affirmed for Himself, to describe Allah with whatever He described Himself with, and to negate from Allah of descriptions of attributes what He negated from Himself and what the Messenger of Allah sallallahu alaihi wasallam negated from Him. So this is the overall principle. Now when it comes to actual negation, the negation part of this methodology, then when we look in the Quran, we see that negation falls into three categories. There are three types of things that we are negating and which are found in the Quran. So the first of those is that we negate from Allah anything which in and of itself is a blameworthy attribute. So for example, we negate from Allah that He is blind, He is deaf, that He is mute, unable to speak. We negate from Allah death, sleep, tiredness, and all those things which we find are in fact negated in the Quran itself. And we mentioned the evidence for that is the statement of Allah Azza wa Jal, وَلِلَّهِ الْمَثَلُ الْأَعْلَى. To Allah belongs the loftiest of description. And this means therefore that Allah cannot be described with things which are blameworthy. So this is the first category. The second category that we negate from Allah, which again we find in the book and the Sunnah, is negation of deficiencies in His attributes. So in His attributes such as knowledge and such as power and so on and so forth, hearing and sight, we negate deficiencies. So this means that Allah does not become tired because He's all powerful. Allah is not unaware of anything because He's all knowing, and so on and so forth. So in the attributes that He does have, then we negate any shortcoming in those attributes, because shortcoming in attributes is found within His creation. Allah Azza wa Jal created His creation with attributes, but in their attributes there are deficiencies and limitations. So our hearing, our sight, our knowledge, in them there are flaws and limitations. So this is the second type of negation from Allah. We negate that there is any deficiency in the attributes that He is described with. And thirdly, we negate any likeness between Allah and His attributes and between the creation. And so this is because Allah Azza wa Jal said, Laysa kamithlihi shay', there is nothing which is a likeness unto Him. So this is what we find in the Quran, that negation is of these three types. Now, we then explained that if someone was to come along and basically say, well, my principle in negating from Allah is just simply to say that I negate any and all resemblance between Allah and His creation. Right? So this is the principle that you are returning to in order to negate from Allah, that I negate any and all resemblance between Allah and His creation. We explained that this is wrong when you come along and say that I negate tashbih, which is resemblance. And the reason for that is because this word of tashbih, it is vague and ambiguous and it actually allows us to, or it allows people to negate Allah's attributes under this vague, ambiguous principle. What we find in the Quran is not the use of the word tashbih and negating resemblance, rather it is negating likeness. Laysa kamithlihi shay. Mithal, there is no mithal, there is no likeness for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. However, if we negate resemblance, then this is not strictly true, because there has to be some degree of resemblance in the meanings of the attributes. So for example, when we say Allah has knowledge, Allah has hearing, Allah has seeing, and Allah has life, then man also has hearing and seeing and knowledge and life. And the only way we can understand the meaning of what Allah is described with is if there is a resemblance in that meaning to what we know and we understand, right? So this is resemblance in terms of the actual ma'na, the meaning. There has to be some degree of resemblance in that meaning. Otherwise, we have to negate all knowledge, all of our knowledge about Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, because anything we affirm for Allah, automatically it means that we resemble Allah. So if we say Allah has life, knowledge, will, power, wisdom, if we negate the meaning, that means we are negating any knowledge and all knowledge of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala under this principle, right? So what is correct is that there has to be some degree of resemblance in the meaning for us to have any knowledge at all about Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So while we affirm that there's some degree of resemblance in the meaning, we have to negate that there is resemblance from all angles and from all aspects, including the reality of these attributes as they are with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So this, we negate resemblance in the reality and in exactly how these attributes are with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, because we don't have this knowledge. And so therefore, if a person was to simply say, we negate any and all resemblance between Allah and His creation, this would be a vague principle that allows somebody to come along and basically deny all of the names, all of the attributes, and we end up not having any knowledge of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala at all, and not grasping anything of the meanings with which Allah Azza wa Jal has spoken to us, has addressed us with in the Quran. And this would entail negation of His attributes. So this cannot be correct. So the whole point in the previous two lessons, the Shaykh here summarizing what Shaykh al-Islam Ibn Taymiyyah said, is to show the difference between the correct type of negation upon the book and the sunnah and incorrect ways of negation that lead to misguidance. And one of those is where you say, well, I'm going to negate resemblance from Allah. This is going to be my principle when I speak about Allah, that I will negate any and all resemblance. This implies that you now have to negate every description, because there has to be some degree of resemblance in the meanings of what Allah has conveyed to us with respect to His attributes. Otherwise, we would have no knowledge at all. We would understand nothing. So there has to be that degree of resemblance in the basic meaning, in the aslul ma'na, in the basic of the meaning of the attribute. So we know what power means, we know what knowledge means, we know what hearing means, we know what seeing means, we know what life means. But when it comes to the actual realities, then this is unknown to us. So we affirm the attribute, but we negate any likeness, right? So it is likeness that we are negating, because this is the word that came in the Quran, laysa kamithlihi shay. So it is tamthil, we are negating. Okay, so once this is clear, we can now proceed to the lesson for today, the lesson for today, which is now going to address another false principle that is used by the people of Kalam when they negate from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Right? So in the last two lessons, we looked at the principle of negating resemblance, and we said this is a vague principle, ambiguous principle. This is not the way of the Quran. And in this lesson, we're going to look at another vague, ambiguous principle. That is another way that some of the people of Kalam use in order to negate from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So, Sheikh Ibn Uthaymeen, rahimahullah, he begins the next section by basically saying that when it becomes clear that it is not correct to rely upon just merely negating resemblance, when we come to negate from Allah, and this is a corrupt path, then there is another path which is even more corrupt than this one. And this path is when, for example, let's say someone was to describe Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala with things which are blameworthy attributes, such as, for example, illness and giving birth and crying and grieving or being sad, right? These things we know Allah Azza wa Jal is above all of these things, and these are blameworthy things. Lofty is Allah above these things. Now, from here, there are two ways you can explain why this is wrong. There are two routes through which you can say why these descriptions are wrong, why these alleged attributes are wrong. You can either follow the way of the Quran and the Sunnah, and you can say, well, these descriptions do not befit Allah because they are blameworthy, and Allah's attributes are attributes of perfection. So Allah cannot be described with these things because they are blameworthy attributes. That's one way you can come and negate these descriptions. However, another way, and this is the way of the people of Kalam, is they will come and they will say, well, the reason why Allah can't be described with these types of attributes or descriptions is because they imply that He is a body. They imply that Allah is a jism, a body. If He was to be described with these things, then He would be a jism, a body which is occupying a space, and this is impossible, so therefore Allah cannot be described with these things. So what are they doing? They are basically adding another layer of explanation, a philosophical layer, which is taken from Greek philosophy, and they are trying to say that the reason why these negative attributes like giving birth and being ill and so on and so forth, why Allah can't be described with them is because this would necessitate that He is a body, right? And so they are negating. So what is the overall principle involved here? It is to negate jismiyyah from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. It is to negate tajasim, right? So remember in the previous lessons, we said the general principle of negating tashbih is vague and ambiguous. Well, this one, to negate jismiyyah, to negate tajasim, which means to render something to be a body, make something a body. They say that this is going to be our principle in negating from Allah. So anything that implies Allah is a body, we will negate it, right? Now, upon this very principle, this is the very principle that the Jahmiyyah and the Mu'tazila, they negated the attributes of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, because they said that attributes can only exist in a thing which is a body, and a body is anything that has dimensions and it has bulk. This is what they say in the philosophy. And because attributes can only exist in other things, if we say Allah has attributes, that means He must be a body, right? This is the negation of jismiyyah is the foundation of the way the Jahmiyyah and the Mu'tazila speak about Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Now, if you were to use this as a principle in speaking about Allah, and in fact, where is this taken from? This is taken from Aristotle. And if you look on there's a second handout for this lesson. It's called The Principle Used in Negation, a Comparison. It basically has a chart. It has 4 columns in the table, and it compares between 4 different ways of negating for Allah. One which is negation upon the book and the sunnah, one which is negation of tashbih or resemblance, which we covered in the previous 2 lessons, and the third column here, it says negation of jismiyah. Right? So on the reverse of this handout, on the other side of this handout, you can see once again there is a list of Aristotle's 10 categories, and this is from the physics or the metaphysics of Aristotle. And what they are basically saying is that when we look at everything in nature, we see objects, we see things, we see trees, tables, we see objects, stones, rocks, we see animals, everything, it is a body. And something is either a body, everything that we observe is either a body or the qualities of that body, or the attributes of that body. It is either a jawhar, a substance, or it is the arad, right, which is like some sort of attribute that exists with that body. And so this is what Aristotle looked at the creation, and he said basically we can categorize everything into 10 categories, one of which is a substance, and the remaining 9 are the actual other attributes, such as quantity, quality, where its place, its time, its position, is it acting or is it being acted upon, right? So using this physics or this metaphysics, and as we explained before, we are not in need of the philosophy of Greek star worshipping idolaters in order for us to understand what Allah is described with and what He's not described with, right? We do not need Greek philosophy to understand the Quran. We do not need the physics or the metaphysics of Aristotle to help us understand what Allah should be described with and what He should not be described with, right? But these people made this to be a foundation for their speech about Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So basically what they are saying is that anything that implies Allah is a body, then we have to negate it. So this means they will now negate things which have come in the Quran and the Sunnah. For example, Allah Azza wa Jal, He says, Ar-Rahmanu ala al-arshi istawa. Allah, or Ar-Rahman, He ascended above the throne. He ascended above the throne. They will say, well, according to Aristotle, and according to the 10 categories of Aristotle, if we say that something or someone is in a direction, if we say Allah is above, this implies that Allah is in a direction. And if Allah is in a direction, it implies that He is in a place. And if He is in a place, He must be occupying that place. And if He's occupying a place, He must be a body. He must be a jism. So this means Allah cannot be above His throne, cannot be ascended above His throne. So you can see how using this principle, they are now negating what Allah Azza wa Jal clearly affirmed for Himself. And it doesn't imply in any way that just because Allah Azza wa Jal is above His creation, that He must therefore be a body like the created bodies. No. Allah Azza wa Jal is above His throne, as He said. We do not know the reality of His essence, of His being. We don't know. It is unlike the essences of all the other bodies in His creation. And just because He's above His throne, above His creation, does not imply that His being or His essence is like our essences. Not at all. So this shows that if we make our principle negation of jismiyah, this will lead us to misguidance as well. And this is the very misguidance of the Jahmiyyah and the Mu'tazila and the people of Kalam in general. So now, after introducing this point, Shaykh Ibn Uthaymeen, rahimahullah, he summarizes 4 or 5 arguments to show why it is wrong to rely upon this principle. Why it is wrong to make this to be our principle in the negation in negating for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So we'll go through these 5 points. The first one, he says, is that this type of word or these types of terminologies to do with jism, a body, and jawhar, which is a substance, and tahayyuz, which is like spatial occupation. These are philosophical terms. They are very vague and general terms, and through them you neither establish truth nor do you invalidate falsehood. These words have not come in the Quran. They have not come in the Quran or the Sunnah, and neither in negation nor in affirmation. So in the Quran it doesn't say Allah is not a jism, nor does it say in the Quran Allah is a jism, right? So these words have not been employed in the texts, neither in affirmation nor in negation. And we have not seen anyone use them from the Salaf, from the companions, from their students, the Tabi'een, and nor from the great Imams of this religion. These are innovated, foreign, philosophical terminologies that people brought into the religion. So that's the first thing, that we do not find any of this language in the Quran or the Sunnah, and therefore it violates our general principle of affirming for Allah what He affirmed for Himself, and negating for Allah what He negated from Himself. So we do not find in the Quran and the Sunnah Allah saying, or the Messenger saying, Inna Allah laysa bijism. Indeed, Allah is not a jism, not a body. We do not find this language anywhere. That's the first point. The second point in refutation of this, making this to be a principle in negation, is that we do not need this additional layer of explanation for us to understand why these attributes such as being ill and giving birth and feeling sad and these kind of crying and things like that, why they cannot be ascribed to Allah. We do not need to say Allah is not described with them because it implies He is a body. No, because everybody knows, even the most common person and the arm people, just upon hearing these descriptions, they know that they are repugnant and they are blameworthy, and Allah Azza wa Jal is free of them, and He can never be described with them, because this is known through the fitrah. It is known by natural, the natural disposition, the intuition. And when a person hears that, when it is claimed that Allah gives birth, or that Allah grieves, or that Allah becomes tired, or whatever it might be, they know that these things are automatically false. Right? This is very clear, plain and obvious. However, if you said to someone, Allah is not a jism, Allah is not a jism, and Allah does not occupy space, well, from this, it's confusing, it's vague, it's ambiguous. We don't know what a person really means, and the common person wouldn't really understand. Well, what are you trying to say? Allah is not a body. Allah does not occupy space. On the surface, it seems that these things appear to be true and correct, but really they're ambiguous, and falsehood could be intended, as well as truth could be intended as well. So they are vague and ambiguous. So why would we need to leave what is clear and apparent, which everybody understands, that when someone says Allah gives birth, Allah becomes tired, Allah grieves, Allah becomes sad, all people know this is false. Why would we need to confuse things and say, well, actually these things can't be descriptions of Allah because they imply He's a body and He occupies space, right? So now we are just making something that is very apparent and clear, which everybody is going to reject upon hearing it. Now you're just clothing it with some confusion and ambiguity. So this is a second reason, or a second angle, why this principle cannot be correct, why we cannot make this to be our kind of universal principle when it comes to negating from Allah, because of its ambiguity, again, similar to negation of tashbih as has preceded. Now, the third reason The third reason why we can't use this as a principle is someone might come along and say that I describe Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala with these things, giving birth, like a Christian could come along and say, well, Allah gave birth and Allah was remorseful, or whatever things they might find in the Bible, in the Old Testament, or whatever it might be. And they might say, well, we say these things. And likewise, there might be some amongst the misguided Muslims, like some amongst the Rafida, the Shia, the Mujassima, those who, in history, there were sects who basically made these types of statements, attributing to Allah the likeness of creatures, of men. They might say, well, we affirm for Allah these affairs, but we negate tajseem. We negate that He is a body, and so just like you might say that we affirm for Allah that He hears and sees, but without implying tajseem, then we can say the same thing, that we say Allah, He gives birth and He rests, and these kind of things, but without tajseem, right? They can say the same thing, and so it opens the door for people to make affirmations of things which are false when they ascribe these things to Allah, things which are false, and then try to defend themselves by saying, well, we affirm these things without making tajseem. Right? So this opens the door for this approach, whereas the actual method of the Quran, when we say we negate from Allah anything which is a blameworthy attribute, an attribute of deficiency, right? And we've closed the door right there. So Allah cannot become tired, Allah does not become sad, Allah is not remorseful, Allah does not give birth, because these are deficiencies, and these things are negated in the Quran because they are deficiencies in and of themselves, right? So this now is very clear. We've closed the door. But if you say, well, we negate from Allah anything which implies He's a body, then you're opening up the door for all sorts of other people to come along and to try and defend themselves by affirming something false for Allah, saying Allah gives birth, Allah becomes tired, or Allah becomes sad, and then defending themselves by saying, but we do not say He is a body. We deny He is a body, and just because we say Allah becomes sad or becomes or gives birth does not imply He is a body. So we're doing the same thing, exactly what the affirmers of the attributes are doing. They say Allah hears and sees, and He has knowledge and He has will, but without implying or without necessitating that He's a body. So we deny He's a body, and we affirm these attributes. So we are just doing the same thing. We are just saying Allah gives birth, Allah becomes sad, Allah grieves, Allah, but without implying He's a body. So this is from the consequences of making this to be the principle, the negation of tajseem, the negation of the jismiyah, right? It is an inadequate, it is a flawed, it is an ambiguous way of negating from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, which then opens the door to many other kind of false arguments. The fourth reason that the Shaykh gives is that this method, actually, to rely upon this principle is the very reason why the Jahmiyyah and the Mu'tazila, this is what they depended upon in order to negate all of the attributes from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, because they said that if Allah Azza wa Jal is described with attributes such as knowledge, power, hearing, will, and so on and so forth, we know that attributes can only exist in things, in bodies which have bulk and dimension, and so if we were to affirm attributes for Allah, it would imply that Allah too, he must have a body like the created bodies. And so this is a false type of analogy, because we do not know how is the essence of Allah, and we do not know how the attributes exist with Allah. We don't have that knowledge. So you cannot say that just because Allah has attributes, He must therefore be a body like we are bodies, right? We see bodies in the created in the creation. It's not implied at all. This is basically a person making a false analogy between Allah and His creation. That if Allah is described with attributes, then He must be a body like the creation have attributes. No, this is a false analogy. You can't make that. You can't analogize for Allah with His creation, right? So this is the fourth reason why this principle cannot be relied upon in terms of our speech, in terms of negation, because it is the very principle and the very argument used by the people of Kalam to negate all of Allah's attributes. The fifth and final reason that's given is that we see that the people who use this actually fall into contradiction. They fall into contradiction. So the two examples we can give is, let's say, for example, we have the Mu'tazila, for example, and they might say, well, we negate the attributes of Allah. We negate Allah has hearing, seeing, knowledge, will, power, because it implies He's a body. But at the same time, they actually affirm Allah's names. They say Allah is knowing, hearing, powerful, seeing, wise, but they negate that these names indicate attributes. Right? So they affirm the names, but they negate the attributes. And then they say if Allah has attributes, it implies He's a body. But this is a contradiction, because you are affirming names for Allah, and we do not know anything which has a name, anything which is said to be knowing, hearing, seeing, living, except that it is a body. So you have to apply this argument consistently and equally. You can't affirm one thing and say, well, this does not imply Allah is a body, and then negate another thing, in this case the attributes, and say, well, because they imply Allah is a body. This is a contradiction. This is something that the Mu'tazila fall into. And likewise, the Ash'aris, they also fall into a contradiction, because they affirm 7 attributes. They say we can accept Allah has life, knowledge, hearing, seeing, power, will, and speech. We accept these because reason, because intellect proves them. But we cannot accept that Allah becomes pleased, becomes angry, that He ascends above His throne, and so on and so forth. But how are you distinguishing between one or the other? How is it that these attributes imply Allah is a body, that He becomes pleased and angry, and that He has wisdom and things like that, and yet hearing and seeing and life and wish, how come these things don't imply that Allah is a body? Right? This is another contradiction. It's a contradiction. So the point being that if you make this to be the principle, the negation of jismiyah, of embodiment, right, of tajseem, if you say this is going to be our overarching universal principle in negating for Allah, that whenever we negate anything, it is on the basis of this principle. If you do that, then you are going to fall into contradictions, along with the previous 4 things that we mentioned as well. So this is the fifth and final explanation as to why this principle is false, is because those who rely upon it, they actually fall into contradiction, because they affirm some things and they negate other things. They affirm the names of Allah yet negate His attributes, or they affirm some of His attributes and negate other attributes. How then can you apply this principle consistently, uniformly, and without contradiction? Well, you can't. And this shows why this is also wrong and why it is false. So this brings us to an end of the discussion of this particular issue of why we cannot rely upon the negation of jismiyah. And then we have another column in the handout, the final column, which we say, which is like another approach, which is the way of the Ash'aris and the Maturidis. And they have a principle, and they say, well, when we negate from Allah, we are saying that Allah Azza wa Jal, we negate from him, or we say that he is يخالف الحوادث, right? That he opposes all things which are newly occurring, which are events, right? This is what they say. Al-hawadith. Al-hawadith means, events, things which happen, things which occur, things which come to be. And so they have this principle saying, they say mukhalafatul hawadith. We say that from the attributes we affirm for Allah is that He opposes all hawadith. And what this means, what they are really getting at here is they are trying to basically avoid affirming that Allah has a will through which He speaks and acts. Right? So in the Quran and the Sunnah, we know Allah Azza wa Jal, He's affirmed for Himself that He speaks and He acts whenever He wills, with whatever He wills. Allah is fa'alun lima yurid. Allah is the doer of whatever He wills. Right? And Allah creates when He wills to create. Allah speaks or reveals revelation, the Quran, the Torah, the Injil, whenever He wills to do so. These are actions of Allah which are tied to His will. Now what these people are saying is that if we affirm actions for Allah, that Allah acts, this implies that Allah Azza wa Jal has now been subject to change, that Allah has been subject to, there's a change in His essence. And really, this is the reason, where they are taking this from is, again, it goes back to Aristotle. So if you turn the sheet over and look on the other side of the sheet and you look at, from the list, you look at number 7, the list of a'rad, the list of incidental attributes, number 7, it says action, right? This is what Aristotle said, that from the attributes of a body or a substance is that it acts. So using this principle, they are saying, well, if Allah acts, it means He must be a body. So we cannot ascribe this to Allah, right? So this is another futile, false principle that is used by the Ash'aris and Maturidis. They are trying to negate that Allah has a will through which He speaks and through which He acts. And these actions of Allah are not eternal. They are not eternal. For example, when Allah willed to create the creation, then He performed that act. That act of Allah is not something which is eternal, because otherwise all of the creation would be eternal with Allah. Right? So Allah's actions have to be tied to His will, that He chooses to act, to create, or to speak, or to do whatever, and then He performs that action, and that action has a beginning as an end. The action is not eternal. Why? Because it's tied to His will. So when Allah willed to create, then He commenced the creation, and then He completed the creation. And just because Allah performed this act does not mean that He is created, or that He has been subject to change. Right? This is all philosophical baggage that these people are taking from Aristotle and trying to impose it upon the Quran and the Sunnah. And all of this is false. So this is, we do not need the philosophy of the star worshipping idolaters to help us understand the Quran. And that's what these people are basically doing. They're basically trying to say that, well, we can't really understand Tawheed. We can't really understand what Allah is described with and what is negated from Allah unless we bring in philosophy and this type of logic and the philosophy of the Greeks and this type of metaphysics. And all of this is misguidance. The prophets and messengers never knew any of this, nor did they use any of this. It is sufficient what is in the Quran and the Sunnah upon the clear Arabic tongue. So we can kind of bring our lesson to a close with this. What we've covered in the previous 2 lessons and this lesson is that we've looked at the true methodology of negating for Allah, the categories. We negate for Allah anything which is blameworthy in itself as an attribute. Secondly, we negate for Allah any deficiency in His actual attributes. Thirdly, we negate for Allah any likeness in his attributes, between Allah's attributes and the creation. And then we looked at three other incorrect, corrupt ways or insufficient ways or principles which are ambiguous or flawed. One of them was to simply rely upon the negation of resemblance. The second one was to rely upon the negation of jismiyah or tajseem. And the third one, which is to negate hawadith, right? To negate that Allah acts through His will, that Allah has actions tied to His will. All of these are false and corrupt, and this is what the people of Kalam entered into. So with that, we can bring this lesson to a close, and I hope it becomes clear now the difference between the methodology of the Quran, which is simple, clear, sufficient, everybody can understand it, and between these ambiguous kind of vague principles which are influenced by philosophy of the Greeks, and which open the door to confusion and misguidance. And so with that, we can bring this lesson to a close. Walhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. Wa sallallahu ala nabiyyina Muhammad wa ala alihi